Okay. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the second Don't Feed the Algae series. We really appreciate you joining us. As Shannon mentioned, this will be recorded, so you can share it. It'll be available on our website, because this is building on the work that we have done for the last 20 years to protect our river from green slime, and we'll continue to connect the dots. There's not a silver bullet, unfortunately, to get green algae out of our waterways, but if we understand the holistic approach that this series is designed to do, we can all work together to protect not only ourselves, but our river from green slime. So here's the list of the webinars that we have so far. The one from May 13th is actually available on our website at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. Today we'll be discussing river rising and resiliency. What does that mean in the whole conversation? Next time on June 10th, how to be more river friendly. This information is really exciting because it's stuff we can do in our everyday life to protect our river, which I know many of you have asked questions about already. Later, we'll be talking about Free the Akawaha. What does restoring our largest tributary mean in the discussion to fortify our river from green slime? The sewage sludge debacle we've been working on the headwaters and right here in the lower St. Johns River over the last 2 years, and the water withdrawals in Central Florida. Will wrap up the series on July 22nd. So what we're starting each one, if we go to the next slide, just an introduction of who we are. We are a 20-year-old organization, and our mission is to defend the St. Johns River and advocate for its protection. We can't do that alone. We have to do it with an army of advocates. And so we hope you will all join our army. I know some of you all have worked with us for many years, and we appreciate your commitment to the St. Johns. But to do this work, we have to investigate issues. We have to come up with solutions based on good science, and then advocate for both policy changes as well as changes in our everyday life that's more river friendly. Educate the public on how to be engaged, make it really easy for you all to help us give our river a voice, raise awareness, and of course, engage and involve citizens. All the work we do is based on citizen-based advocacy. And so just a quick overview of green algae. On the agenda, we'll just do a quick, every one of these we're starting with just an understanding of what algae is, why it shows up in the summer, and why it continues to threaten our opportunity to engage with the river. Today's focus will be on river rising and resiliency. What does saltwater intrusion and sea level rise and solutions have? What can they do to help protect our river from algae? And then don't feed the algae. What are tips we can take, steps we can take right now to be part of the solution? Next slide. So what is algae? Algae is really the symptom of the source of pollution that's nitrogen and phosphorus. Unfortunately, we have high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in our river. These nutrients occur naturally, but when there's an abundance, when there's too much, that's when you see the outbreaks of algae under the right conditions. The pollution's there throughout the year, but under right conditions is when we start seeing the green slime on the surface. It's when you have warmer weather, and we're starting to see warmer weather more year round. So we're seeing blooms earlier and earlier. We had our first report this year back in February. When there's sunlight that rises it to the surface, as well as when you have slow moving water, when there's not a lot of wind. You can have algae one day, and then the afternoon it's not there because of wind and these different conditions. But the root cause of the pollution of these algae outbreaks is the pollution. And so that's what the goals are, is to make sure that we reduce those sources. And the other thing is what we could all take steps. One, we have to stop the pollution. We have to stop pollution at its source. We have to avoid exposure. It's important that you know this can be very toxic, and protect yourselves, protect your pets, and make sure you're being safe around these algal outbreaks, and you're letting your neighbors know. There's nothing worse than seeing people and getting exposed. And also report, test, and monitor. For us to get a voice in Tallahassee and in local governments, We have to report these outbreaks and make sure that people understand this isn't just a South Florida issue or Lake Okeechobee issue. This is something we've been experiencing in the St. John's for years, and we need to have that reported. So we'll give tips on how to do that. And again, the health impacts, we can't stress this enough. You can get exposed to algae, short-term exposure. You can have respiratory issues. It can cause skin problems. It can cause stomach issues. And so you need to be careful not to ingest, inhale on the short term. And also long-term exposure can have much more impact to liver issues and neurological issues. Not only is this problematic for us as humans, but also to our pets. And so if you see scum along the banks of the river, please don't let your pets be exposed. And then of course, don't eat fish that are caught out of these waters. There are links to the Florida Department of Health for more details on how to protect yourself, but we just need to remember as we are reporting to protect yourselves. So that was just our little overview of Green Algae 101. Now I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Blankenship, our Advocacy Director, to focus on river rising and resiliency. Shannon?
Thank you, Lisa, for that important background to algae before we get started. Can I just ask, Lisa, can you see the participant list up on the screen? I just want to make sure that I'm sharing my screen, but I want to make sure everyone can't see my the Zoom. It's not getting right in the way of the PowerPoint, is it? Okay, well, I would guess not. So today what we're going to focus on is our work to promote a resilient St. John's River. And specifically, we want to connect that work and how much we've been putting into having resilient St. John's to how it is also the same work to prevent the green monster from forming. Resilient policies not only protect our communities during disaster, but they fortify our river against algae bloom outbreaks. To really start this conversation though, I want to begin by defining resiliency and explaining why we've taken such an outsized role in our effort to promote more resilient policies. The way that I think is just the easiest description of what resiliency is to look at this idea of an impact curve. So say you have a disaster, for example, a hurricane. Your community's capacity to rebound from that disaster is essentially how resilient your community is. So a very resilient community will have fewer interruptions in essential services like food production, electricity, wastewater infrastructure. People can get back to work, they can get back to their homes quickly. A less resilient city will simply take longer and they'll spend more money, more resources to get back to those pre-disaster conditions, if at all possible. So resilient policies make our community stronger and less prone to devastation when and if a disaster occurs. Now, let's look at the climate change impacts predicted for the southeastern US. First of all, these are in no way a holistic representation on some of the impacts we expect to see from climate change, but they are some of the ones that will have the greatest significance on the St. John's. One of those being, we expect more frequent storms. In addition, more precipitation from each of those storms. And then last, a greater intensity from each of those storms, and then those storms lasting longer. To back up, mitigating against climate change by taking immediate steps to reduce our carbon emission footprint. That includes restoring forests, wetlands, and ecosystems. These are the types of solutions that will aid in fighting against these threats. However, we have to plan for adapting to this new reality because it will have significant consequences for the health of the St. John's. Specifically in the St. John's, we're looking at the impacts of flooding, the impacts of storms, and then the impacts of these extremes that we expect, the extremes of drought versus flood. I'm going to break down a slide for each of these things to explain not only how they impact us, but how they impact the growth of algae blooms. So first of all, flooding. Every single flooding event is an unmitigated pollution impact to the St. John's. Every flood brings with it increased nutrient pollution. That means all of those retention ponds sitting in the parking lots of our strip malls that we go to or in our neighborhoods, those things serve to capture nutrient runoff, and every flood event means those nutrients run right into our waterways. Every lawn, our golf courses, agricultural fields, our city-owned parks where fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides are applied, those are now direct sources to the St. John's, and this includes our wastewater treatment facilities. They become they get over capacity and they have flooding incidents. Now, as floodwaters recede, what we have are nutrient concentrations much higher in our waterways, and then we are likely to see more algae blooms after even our average summer thunderstorms. But now, with increased storms and more frequent storms, the chance for more algae blooms because of flooding impacts. So now efforts to repair, policies that will update infrastructure, these things either eliminate the river as a stormwater outfall, or we can work to increase buffers, increase natural shorelines, connections to our waterfront. They allow floodwaters to have spaces to move. They provide natural areas like wetlands, shorelines, floodwaters can settle. All of these things reduce impacts of polluted water from reaching the St. John's. Those are just some examples of policies that can help to not only protect us against floods, but also serve that water quality benefit that will help us prevent those summertime algae blooms. Storms. So something that I think a lot of people don't think about when you think about storms is that what happens when a storm impacts the river is that the water in the system churns, mixes, and moves. And what happens is the sediment that has long been settled on the riverbed now can become redistributed into the water column. So specifically in the lower St. John's, where we've had historic factories that allowed for discharges of metals, of chemicals that we now define as toxic, of PCBs, those toxins can now become reintroduced. Animals and plant life can now re-ingest them and be impacted by them again. Sediments are now mixed into the system from these storms and just from the velocity and the movement that thunderstorms bring into our river. Specifically, phosphorus is a nutrient that clings onto sediment, and when storms come through, it breaks up that connection, and so it causes a major reintroduction of phosphorus into the river. So more nutrients in our water column following a storm is an automatic impact and fuel for more algae bloom growth. Last, I want to talk about these extremes. So moving between droughts and floods and what that does to the river. So flooding brings about an increase in pollutants that I've already discussed, an increase in nutrients to the river, but it also brings with it higher water levels. Now, when Hurricane Irma impacted the St. John's River, what we saw were higher water levels in the St. John's for nearly a year. Water levels in the St. John's, as the storm moved through the St. John's, as I just described, it hit the riverbed, it impacted our grasses, all the submerged grasses that cling to the sediments and cling to the shorelines, they were torn up. And then when the grasses, after the grasses were lost, the capacity for them to regrow was more difficult because now we had this long period of higher water levels. The tannic water and the dark water made it so that the sun was unable to penetrate as deeply and to allow those grasses to regrow. The grasses are the nursery and habitat for the mussels, the crabs, the mollusks, the invertebrate, and all of the species that call our river home, but they're also filters, and they serve to cleanse and they serve to provide oxygen to the St. John's. So the loss of these grasses following the hurricane was one of the causes of the algae bloom that occurred in 2018 and 2019. In fact, the loss of grasses is still impacting the river today. In addition, the other side of that extreme is drought. And what happens is our river is habitat to so many species, and then the balance of salt water coming into our river, when we lose that freshwater flow, we have a concentration of salt water. That salt water is able to burn those aquatic plants and impact the habitat that's needed to allow for that balance in our river to flourish and grow. So resiliency and the St. Johns River. How can becoming more resilient help to protect the communities along the river, but how can it also prevent those algae blooms in the St. Johns? So here's what we immediately need to do. First, and most importantly, we have to protect what we have. So that means stopping right now and saying to our naturalized shorelines that exist, let's keep them that way. To our wetlands that remain, let's continue to allow those wetlands to serve that critical resiliency function that they currently do. To our tributaries, let's protect our tributaries and let's keep them clean. And to our forests that are serving this incredible mitigating factor against climate change, but also just helping to hold the line. We have to protect what we currently have. But second, we need to really think about policies that will mitigate against the impacts we're already making, and policies to adapt and then prepare for a future of rising waters. And as I mentioned before, policies that will help to update our infrastructure, ensure that the river isn't the natural outfall for all of these flooding events, but actually that our infrastructure can handle and hold larger capacities of bigger storms, more frequent storms. These will be the types of policies that we need to take immediately in order to mitigate, in order to adapt, in order to prepare. And then last, we have to immediately restore our tributaries. And that includes the land that surrounds these tributaries, our marshlands and our wetlands. Tributaries specifically can hold floodwater, but right now, so many of our tributaries are have been neglected for so long that we see these tributaries losing that capacity to hold floodwaters because they've been filled in, sediment has grown, they've lost the natural connections to the marsh that once was there, they've lost the connection to the wetlands, they've lost their meandering tendencies, and they've become filled in. And so really thinking about restoring our tributaries as places that can then hold, absorb, and protect us against flooding will also help to protect us against the water quality impacts of rising waters and of our future. So specifically, some actions that we can take right now, I wanted to mention what's going on at the local level, and then I want to mention what's going on at the state level, because there are two different places here where we can take action. The city of Jacksonville has recently formed a special committee on resiliency. As of January of 2020. After a few months hiatus, they are actually reconvening tomorrow, May 28th, virtually. Lisa is going to put the link to the special committee, how to register, how to join in our chat window. You can join virtually and even if you don't speak, even if you just show support, show how important this issue is, that our policies that can protect all of us can also protect us against algae blooms. It's critical that they see this mass of people involved in this issue. It's what's driven this issue so far forward already, and I think it's what's going to help us continue to drive forward in the future. In the city of Orlando, already quite ahead of the city of Jacksonville, they already have an office of sustainability and resilience, and that office holds community workshops, and they have several coming up specifically on composting and recycling. In 2018, they actually authored a community action plan, which you can find on their website and learn more about all of the things that the city of Orlando is doing to have a proactive stance for resilience, which then of course connects to our water quality issue. And last, I want to mention that Governor DeSantis took bold leadership early in his position, and he appointed a state chief resiliency officer. Julia Neshawat recently completed a report looking at the status and the immediate needs of resiliency in the state of Florida. However, Julia was recently appointed by President Trump to become the Homeland Security Advisor, and her position is now vacant. I haven't seen anything about filling this position, but it is needed because the report that she published, which is really good and really bold actions that need to be taken right now, will not be championed with no champion. So with that, I want to leave us with the 2020 hurricane trajectory forecast. Once again, we're looking at a higher than average hurricane season. It does start on June 1, just next week. There are predicted to be more than 13 named storms, up to 6 to 10 hurricanes, and then more than 3 major hurricanes. That means resulting in category 3 to category 5 and up to 111-mile-per-hour winds. So we know that this is in the future. So being ready and being prepared for this, for what is to come, really starts now. And with that, Lisa, I'll turn it back over to you to talk about what we're seeing with algae blooms and reports in the basin currently. Hey, Lisa, you're muted. Hang on.
Okay, I think I'm good. Sorry, I have a 13-year-old and 11-year-old. It was lunchtime, so I had to mute for a moment. But thank you, Shannon, for that wonderful overview. It was quite inclusive, and I hope you all understand the importance of making sure not only are we more resilient to future storms, but more resilient to nutrient pollution runoff. And back to, again, we just, one of the purposes of this series is to make sure, and sorry, can you go back to that slide? Is to make sure that we know it, we avoid it. Everyone's health is of most importance, but we report it. The only way we can have a voice and get more protections for our St. Johns River is to report these outbreaks throughout the watershed. And so some of the, next slides, some of the 2020 reports, we had just last week in Plumbers Cove, just south of Jacksonville, the report of algae. Once the wind picked up, it decimated. So I don't think there was a sample taking of this one, but it was reported. Again, it gets on the map to make sure we understand it. There's one back in April from Satsuma. If there's any other reports that anyone has that hasn't been reported, we really need to focus on getting these dots on the map. Obviously we don't want to see as many outbreaks on this dashboard from the Department of Environmental Protection, but if they're in our river, they need to be on this dashboard because they're registered. The agencies will take toxin reports so we can determine if toxins are present, what species, what types, and then that can give us indication too if it's phosphorus or nitrogen fueling the outbreak. So this aids us in not only registering and that it's happening, but also what are the solutions that we can advocate for. Next slide. And so here's how you report. This is all at our website at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. We do ask that you report it to the state hotline so it appears on that map and the agencies are alerted, but also report it to Shannon. It's Shannon at stjohnsriverkeeper.org so we can track and make sure that the agencies are following through on the testing. They don't always test every single site because by the time they go out, it may have already, the winds have picked up and it may not be present. And so what we want to do is make sure we're tracking it and then not only making sure the agencies are out there, but we have a team of water testers throughout the watershed. In fact, I see Bill Zobe on the line. He's one of ours in the headwaters that's done sampling down in Lake Washington area in Brevard County. And we have trained volunteers that can go and see if toxins are present. And that can help give us another tool to protect all of you that are wanting to enjoy the river, but also to engage with our policymakers to get these pieces in place to stop pollution at its source. And we want you to continue on this conversation. Every one of these webinars we have is going to lead to another discussion, as well as we're launching next Wednesday a series of podcasts talking about solutions. The last thing we want to do is talk about problems without focusing on solutions. And so if you're concerned about climate change and being more resilient, you'll enjoy this River Rising series that kicks off next week with Shannon Blankenship, as well as our executive director, Jimmy Orth. And we have guest speakers kicking off next week with the Times Union, Nate Monroe. And for more river-friendly tips, more things we all can do right at home, we're continuing our updates with Gabby from our Middle Basin. We'll be talking about more citizen science, what all of us can do to collect data and information, specifically on Friday talking about rainfall data. We had a lot of rain in some sections of the river yesterday, but not in all sections of the river. And so it's critical that we have as much information, and there's lots of opportunities for citizen science to help us be more river friendly. So tune into this series on Fridays, as well as at our website. You can see past featured sections about things you can do in your home. And then of course, we always ask for you to visit our website to get plenty of merchandise. I see some great Riverkeeper shirts online today. We have hats. We actually have a Don't Feed the Algae t-shirt for all of us that are working on this effort. And become a member. This is all of the work we do is based on private donations. We don't take government dollars because it's our work to hold the government accountable. And so if you're not a member, we encourage you to become a member and to tune in. We have lots of information so you can get regular updates on this and all the issues we're working on. But you can find all this information at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. So wrapping up, I just want to thank you all for tuning in today. I see lots of conversation in the chat room, but also mark your calendar for this, the next series of Don't Feed the Algae on June 10th. And we'll be specifically talking about all the river-friendly things that you can do in your yard and provide, or your home, and provide more resources to become river-friendly and have some challenges so we can all encourage each other to do more. But with that, Shannon, do you want to look at the chat room and let us know if there's some questions there, or if there's some questions that we received before the broadcast?
I will, and I'll jump immediately to some of the questions that we received from those that submitted earlier. And Lisa, I mean, everybody I think wants to know the same thing, and that is, okay, I get it. I understand algae, I understand the connections, and I want to do more. And so, you know, I know that we talked about a lot of ways today that people can get involved, at least locally, but maybe you can speak to, you know, as an advocate, you know, how you'd like to see some more of our members helping with this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, all of us can do things to reduce or eliminate fertilizer in our yard. That's a big win, conserve water. But even if we were all doing everything we can, it's going to take better policy, more protective policy. And so we have to work together at the local level to have the best fertilizer ordinances that we can, and to make sure they're enforced. With the COVID-19 crisis, we've seen inspectors not allowed to do the work they do. And even in normal conditions, it's not really proactive enforcement of the fertilizer ordinances that are in place. And so if you're in St. Johns County, as I see some members are, or Duval, or Brevard County, Volusia County, we know what your fertilizer ordinance is, and make sure that we're enforcing and also reporting. But state policy is going to be one of the most important tools we have. The legislature has the ability to put protections in place that we need, and unfortunately, they haven't kept up. This past year in 2020, we had great hope in Senate Bill 712. It was the Clean Waterways Act. And there was really good potential building on the work that many of us have done with the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Unfortunately, it was watered down significantly throughout the process. And the legislators compromised to special interests. And we need to make sure we don't let that happen. So instead of having some new protections that will prevent and stop pollution at its source, there's plenty of new loopholes and rulemaking that will kick the can down the road. And so you will see us and many advocates across the state coming out with what needs to happen going into 2021. And remember, this is a marathon, not a sprint. But if we all work together with folks throughout the St. Johns River watershed and throughout the state of Florida to stand up to strong policies that have real enforcement, we can get more protections in 2021. But we need all of us to engage and use our voices to protect our St. Johns and protect ourselves and our families. So stay tuned. You will see more information as we gear up for the 2021 legislative session.
And I'll just chime on to that. You know, if it wasn't sort of understood in just the overall theme of what I talked about with this presentation, I think a lot of potential water quality solutions that we're seeing could actually be viewed and perhaps responded to faster through the lens of resiliency, because a lot of municipalities, a lot of counties, and even the state are really looking at resiliency policies and resiliency programs that are going to, you know, lessen that impact of disaster, lessen the impact and the cost of recovery and being more resilient. And if we know that being more resilient means lessening flooding and pollution incidents to the St. Johns, as well as keeping communities safe, then it's a matter of really engaging in those resiliency conversations at your local level to ensure that the solutions they're putting forth aren't just things like build the bulkhead higher, make the bulkhead, you know, stronger, but are actually about, let's build out our naturalized shorelines. Let's make sure that our shorelines retain. Let's make sure we don't lose any additional wetlands. Let's make sure that we keep our forest. So all of these solutions that actually help us be more resilient are also our water quality solutions. And so thinking about algae blooms through the lens of resiliency, I think just gives us a lot of local opportunities. And so if you can engage at the local level with whatever, you know, office is looking into resiliency, I think that's a new approach and a new way to get active in the community, that maybe, you know, you're meeting some new people and finding new reasons for getting at what you've always wanted, which is, you know, more solutions for a cleaner, healthier river.
Well, and I think I see Diane from St. Johns County is talking about trees, and you know, trees provide another great buffer and protection in our parks, our waterfront parks. You know, you see so many communities that are really investing in waterfront parks, which are a great amenity in normal conditions, but then they provide that resiliency component and buffer to filter out pollution during, you know, storms and extreme conditions. And so I know there's efforts underway in many counties to focus on that conversation, and would love to have that more in St. Johns County as well.
Yeah, I know St. Johns County is looking at that, and Lisa mentioned this too, but a lot of counties are looking at some, I would say, more siloed discussions, things about fertilizers, things about trees, and really, you know, so many of them have these water quality impacts. And so I know that the tree conversation in St. John's really does link back to algae blooms, and so that's a good kind of connection piece there. The other question here was about becoming a water tester volunteer, which is great and fantastic. And so I just chimed back in to email Megan at stjohnsriverkeeper.org. She runs our volunteer programs and is helping to get people trained. Again, algae blooms are not really something we want people to get close to, you know, and to interact with because of all the health side effects that Lisa mentioned early on, but trained people with the right equipment and the right safety precautions are really helping us to be able to look at these preliminarily to see if there are toxins present, and then decide whether to advance testing at the lab level. And so that's a great program, and thank you, Anne, for reaching out about that. Hopefully you'll be able to get trained and become a part of that program. Lisa, I don't have any other new questions from the chat window. And again, almost all the questions that were submitted beforehand were really about how to help, how to take action. I think our next segment is really going to jump into that too, with being river friendly, because this is more about at the individual level, what we can do to try to reduce our own personal impact on the algae bloom. So I hope you guys decide to tune in 2 weeks. And again, all of these are recorded on our website too, if you miss one and you want to check it out. Lisa, I'll let you say the final words here. And I just hope to see everyone in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. And thank you all again for tuning in. And just remember, there's not one silver bullet. We have to focus on all of these different ways to fortify our river and our tributaries in all of Florida waters, and also figure out what we can do personally. What can we do to get that in? So we hope by the end of this series, you'll see how all these different pieces fit together. But more importantly, we have a roadmap forward on how we can come up with a comprehensive plan to do our individual best to reduce nutrient pollution, but also to be strong advocates with a collective voice for the St. John's. So thank you all for tuning in. We look forward to continue to collect your questions and continue this conversation on June 10th. But until then, be safe and enjoy Florida waters.
Bye.
Bye.